The sharp crack of a pistol shot echoed across the dusty main street of Twin Falls, Idaho, as Penelope Frost pressed herself against the rough wooden wall of the general store, her heart pounding wildly. One hand cradled her swollen belly, the other clutched the small cloth bundle containing everything she had left in the world. 8 months pregnant and now homeless, she had nowhere to turn and no one to trust in this unforgiving frontier town of 1885. The autumn air bit with unexpected chill as Penelope stumbled away from Twin Falls under cover of darkness. Tears streaked her dirt-smudged face, mixing with the light drizzle that had begun to fall. Just hours earlier, she'd been thrown out of the boarding house where she'd lived since her arrival in town 3 months ago. Mrs. Wilkins, the stern-faced proprietress, had discovered Penelope's condition despite her efforts to conceal it beneath loose dresses and aprons. "No unmarried mothers in my establishment," Mrs. Wilkins had declared, her voice cutting through Penelope like a blade. "What would people think? I run a respectable house." Penelope had pleaded, explaining she had nowhere else to go, that her family back east had disowned her when they learned of her pregnancy. She'd come west hoping for a fresh start, following vague promises from the baby's father, a smooth-talking salesman who had promptly disappeared upon learning of her condition. But Mrs. Wilkins remained unmoved, giving Penelope until sundown to vacate the premises. Now, as lightning flashed across the distant mountains, Penelope trudged along the muddy road leading out of town. The few coins in her pocket wouldn't secure another room, and no one would hire a visibly pregnant woman without references. As rain began to fall in earnest, she spotted the silhouette of a barn on a hillside not far from the road. "Just for tonight," she whispered to her unborn child, changing direction toward the structure. "Tomorrow we'll figure something out." The barn door creaked as she pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The sudden shelter from the rain felt like a blessing, and the sweet smell of hay enveloped her. Penelope made her way to a corner stall, where she arranged a makeshift bed from loose hay. Her body ached with exhaustion, her feet swollen from walking. She knew she shouldn't be here trespassing on someone's property, but desperation had overridden her usual scrupulous nature. "Just tonight," she repeated, curling onto her side, one hand protectively covering her belly as fatigue claimed her. The gray light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the barn walls when Penelope was startled awake by the sound of the large door swinging open. She froze, curling deeper into the hay, hoping to remain undetected, but luck was not on her side. What in tarnation? A deep voice boomed across the barn. Penelope sat up quickly, hay sticking to her hair and dress, her heart pounding with fear. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, wearing a well-worn Stetson and holding a rifle casually in one hand. "I'm sorry," she blurted, struggling to her feet with difficulty due to her advanced pregnancy. "I didn't mean any harm. It was raining and I had nowhere else to go. I'll leave right away." The man's expression shifted from surprise to concern as he took in her condition and bedraggled appearance. He lowered the rifle, setting it against a post. "Hold on now," he said, his voice gentler. "You're in no condition to be wandering about. Sit back down before you fall down." Penelope hesitated, torn between fear of this stranger and the reality of her situation. "Name's Flynn Donovan," he offered, approaching slowly as one might a spooked horse. "This is my ranch, and you are." "Penelope," she replied, reluctantly lowering herself back to the hay. "Penelope Frost." Flynn nodded, keeping a respectful distance. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with intelligent brown eyes that studied her without judgment. "Well, Miss Frost, seems to me you've had a rough night. Mind telling me how a lady in your condition ended up in my barn?" There was something in his steady gaze that compelled honesty. Penelope found herself explaining everything: her journey from Philadelphia following her parents' rejection, the baby's father who had promised to meet her out west but never appeared, her 3 months working at the general store until her pregnancy became too obvious, and finally, being evicted from Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house the previous evening. Flynn listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When she finished, he simply nodded. "You've been dealt a poor hand, Miss Frost, but sleeping in barns isn't a solution." He paused, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. "I've got a house up the hill with a spare room. You're welcome to it until you get your bearings." Penelope stared at him, suspicion flaring. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "My ma would haunt me till my dying day if I left a woman in your condition out in the cold. Besides, I could use some help around the house. My housekeeper left 2 weeks ago to care for her ailing sister and boys." He shrugged. "It's a fair exchange, room and board for whatever help you can manage in your condition." Penelope weighed her options, which were admittedly few. This man seemed decent enough, and the thought of a real bed and roof was tempting beyond measure. "I'm a good cook," she offered cautiously. "And I can clean and mend." Flynn nodded. "Then we have an arrangement, Miss Frost. Temporary, of course, until you decide what comes next." He offered his hand to help her up. "Can you walk to the house, or shall I fetch the wagon?" The question, asked without condescension, touched something in Penelope. "I can walk," she said, accepting his hand. "And thank you, Mr. Donovan." "Flynn," he corrected, releasing her hand once she was steady. "Mr. Donovan was my father." The Donovan ranch house stood on a gentle rise overlooking a creek, surrounded by cottonwoods beginning to turn golden with autumn. It was larger than Penelope had expected, a 2-story structure of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. The interior was unexpectedly comfortable, if somewhat sparse in decoration, with solid furniture and clean pine floors. "It's not much," Flynn said as he showed her to a bedroom on the first floor, "but it's dry and warm." The room was simple: a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a small dresser, washstand, and rocking chair near the window. To Penelope, after months in a tiny attic room at the boarding house, it looked like a palace. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You can thank me by resting," he replied. "You look dead on your feet. I'll fix us some breakfast, then you can sleep." Before she could protest that cooking was supposed to be her contribution, he'd left, closing the door behind him. Penelope sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden turn in her fortunes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps things might work out after all. Over the following weeks, Penelope settled into life at the Donovan ranch. True to her word, she took over the cooking and household duties to the extent her pregnancy allowed. Flynn proved to be a considerate, if somewhat reserved, host. He never questioned her further about her past or the circumstances of her pregnancy, for which she was grateful. She learned he'd inherited the ranch 5 years earlier after his parents died in a stagecoach accident. He ran about 200 head of cattle with the help of 2 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the barn: Pedro Vasquez, a middle-aged Mexican vaquero with extraordinary skill with horses, and Jimmy Winters, a freckle-faced young man barely out of his teens who worshipped the ground Flynn walked on. As November progressed, the weather grew colder. Penelope found comfort in establishing routines: bread baking on Mondays, laundry on Tuesdays when the weather permitted, mending in the evenings by the fire while Flynn read from one of the many books that filled a bookcase in the parlor. They developed an easy companionship. Flynn would tell her about his day with the cattle or his plans for expanding the ranch come spring. Penelope would share recipes she was thinking of trying or amusing observations about the chickens' personalities. They carefully avoided more personal topics, as though by unspoken agreement. One evening, as the first snow of the season fell softly outside, Flynn closed his book and looked at Penelope thoughtfully. "Your time's getting close," he observed. "Have you thought about what comes next?" Penelope's hands stilled over the shirt she was mending. The question had been haunting her, but she'd been pushing it aside, unwilling to face the uncertainty of her future. "I haven't," she admitted. "I know I can't impose on your kindness indefinitely." Flynn frowned. "That wasn't what I meant. I was thinking more practically. The nearest doctor is in Twin Falls, and in winter the road can get impassable. We should have a plan." His concern touched her deeply. "I don't want to return to Twin Falls," she said softly. "Not after how they treated me." Flynn nodded. "I understand. There's a midwife about 5 miles west, Sarah Blackthorne. She's delivered half the babies in the county. I could ride over tomorrow, see if she'd be willing to come when your time arrives." "You've thought of everything," Penelope said, surprised and moved by his consideration. "Not everything," he admitted with a wry smile. "But I do try to be prepared." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "And Penelope, you're not imposing, having you here. It's made this place feel like a home again." Their eyes met across the room, and something unspoken passed between them. Penelope felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down at her sewing. "Thank you," she said simply. The next day, Flynn returned from his visit to the midwife with good news. Sarah Blackthorne had agreed to come when Penelope's time arrived, and Flynn had arranged for Pedro to ride for her at the first sign of labor. As they sat at supper that evening, Flynn seemed unusually thoughtful, pushing food around his plate more than eating it. "Is something wrong?" Penelope asked. He looked up, a strange expression crossing his face. "Mrs. Blackthorne asked if I was the father," he said abruptly. Penelope felt heat rise to her face. "Oh, I'm sorry for the awkwardness that must have caused." Flynn shook his head. "It wasn't awkward, it was thought-provoking." "How so?" Penelope asked, curious despite her embarrassment. He put down his fork and looked at her directly. "It made me realize something. When your baby comes, it'll need a name. A family name." Penelope nodded slowly, the familiar ache of her situation settling in her chest. "I've been thinking about that. I'll give the baby my surname, of course." "You could," Flynn agreed. "Or you could consider another option." Penelope waited, puzzled, as Flynn seemed to gather his thoughts. "I know we haven't known each other long," he finally continued, "but I've come to respect you greatly, Penelope. Your strength, your determination, and I've grown fond of having you here." He cleared his throat. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I'd be honored if you'd consider marrying me." Penelope stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Marry you? But why would you want to? It would give your child a name," he interrupted. "A father, a stable home," he paused, "and it would give me a family." "Flynn, I can't let you sacrifice yourself out of pity," Penelope protested. His eyes darkened. "It's not pity, Penelope. It's admiration. And yes, affection too. I'm not claiming to be madly in love. We've known each other too briefly for that. But I believe we could build a good life together, based on mutual respect and common goals." He smiled slightly. "And who knows what might grow from such a foundation?" Penelope was speechless. The idea was both terrifying and strangely appealing. Flynn Donovan was a good man, honest, hardworking, kind. The thought of her child growing up with such a father figure, with the security of a home and name, was powerfully tempting. "You don't have to answer now," Flynn said gently. "Think about it. The offer stands regardless of your decision." That night Penelope lay awake, her mind racing with Flynn's unexpected proposal. She tried to examine her feelings honestly. She respected Flynn immensely and enjoyed his company. She felt safe with him, valued. Was that enough basis for marriage? And what of love? Her experience with the baby's father had soured her on romantic notions, but she couldn't deny the warm flutter in her chest when Flynn smiled at her, or the way his voice sometimes made her pulse quicken. By morning, she had her answer. She found Flynn at the corral, watching as Pedro worked with a young horse. "I've thought about your proposal," she said without preamble when he turned to greet her. "And," his expression gave nothing away, "I accept on one condition." She took a deep breath. "That you understand I'm not entering this arrangement lightly or out of mere convenience. I genuinely respect and care for you, Flynn. If we do this, I want it to be a real marriage with the possibility of real feeling between us." Relief and something warmer flooded his face. "That's exactly what I want too, Penelope." 3 days later, they rode into Twin Falls with Pedro as witness. The justice of the peace, a balding man with spectacles perched on his nose, raised his eyebrows at Penelope's condition, but performed the ceremony without comment. Mrs. Wilkins, passing by the justice's office, stopped to stare open-mouthed as Flynn Donovan, one of the most eligible bachelors in the county, led his very pregnant bride out into the December sunshine. "Mrs. Donovan," he said with a smile as he helped her into the wagon. "How does that sound?" "Like the beginning of something wonderful," she replied, and was surprised to realize she meant it completely. Their return to the ranch was marked by a small celebration. Jimmy had decorated the house with pine boughs, and Pedro's wife Maria, who lived in a small cabin on the property, had prepared a feast. As they sat around the table, Penelope looked at these people who had so readily accepted her and felt a surge of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. That night, Flynn showed her to the master bedroom. "This is your room now," he said. "I'll take the spare room until we both decide differently." His consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you for not presuming," she said softly. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering for a moment on her cheek. "I meant what I said about building something real, Penelope. That takes time." As December deepened toward Christmas, Penelope threw herself into making the ranch house a true home. She hung curtains she found in a trunk, polished neglected silver, and arranged Flynn's books in a more orderly fashion. Flynn watched her nesting activities with amusement and appreciation, often finding ways to help despite her protests that she could manage. The evening before Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after supper, Flynn presented her with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "An early Christmas gift," he explained, "and something of a wedding present too." Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When Penelope opened it, she found it empty. "I thought," Flynn said hesitantly, "that perhaps we could put a likeness of the baby in it when the time comes." Touched beyond words, Penelope impulsively leaned over and kissed his cheek. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Would you help me put it on?" As Flynn fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck, his fingers warm against her skin, Penelope felt something shift between them, a new awareness, a deepening connection. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold. They exchanged simple gifts, a knitted scarf from Penelope to Flynn, a rocking chair he had secretly ordered from the furniture maker in town for her. They attended church services in Twin Falls, where Penelope held her head high despite the whispers and stares, Flynn's protective presence beside her a shield against judgment. As they drove home, snow began to fall, large flakes drifting lazily from a pewter sky. "It's beautiful," Penelope said, watching the landscape transform. Flynn looked at her, snowflakes catching in her auburn hair. "Yes," he agreed softly. "Beautiful." That evening, as they prepared for bed, Penelope felt a sudden sharp pain that made her gasp. Flynn was at her side instantly. "What is it?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "I think," she said, breathing carefully as the pain subsided, "that your child is eager to make an appearance." Flynn's eyes widened. "The baby's coming, now," Penelope nodded, another contraction building. "I believe so, yes." Despite the snowfall, Pedro immediately set out for Mrs. Blackthorne's while Flynn helped Penelope to bed. Maria arrived from her cabin, bringing clean linens and calm competence. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and waiting, with Flynn refusing to leave Penelope's side despite Maria's insistence that men typically waited elsewhere. "She's my wife," he said firmly. "I won't leave her." Penelope, gripping his hand through contractions, felt a surge of affection for this man who had so unexpectedly become her husband and champion. Mrs. Blackthorne arrived just before midnight, bustling into the room with quiet authority. After examining Penelope, she nodded approvingly. "Everything's progressing well," she assured them. "First babies often take their time, so settle in for a long night." As the hours passed, Penelope drew strength from Flynn's unwavering presence. He wiped her brow, helped her walk when Mrs. Blackthorne suggested it might ease her discomfort, and murmured encouragement through the worst of the pains. It was just after dawn on December 26th, when, with a final exhausting effort, Penelope brought her child into the world. The thin cry that followed was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "A boy," Mrs. Blackthorne announced, efficiently cleaning and wrapping the infant. "A fine, healthy boy." She placed the bundle in Penelope's arms. Through tears of joy and exhaustion, Penelope gazed down at her son, red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." She looked up at Flynn, who was staring at the baby with an expression of wonder. "Would you like to hold your son?" Flynn's eyes met hers, filled with emotion. "Are you sure?" "Of course. You're his father now in all the ways that matter." As Flynn carefully took the baby, his large hands dwarfing the tiny form, Penelope saw his eyes grow damp. "What shall we name him?" he asked, gently rocking the infant. Penelope had given this much thought during her pregnancy. "I'd like to call him Thomas, after my grandfather. He was a kind man who always believed in me." "Thomas Donovan," Flynn said, testing the name. "It has a good sound to it." "Thomas Flynn Donovan," Penelope amended. "If that's all right with you." Flynn looked at her with such tenderness that her breath caught. "More than all right," he said softly. "It's perfect." As winter settled fully over the Idaho countryside, the Donovan household adjusted to life with a newborn. Thomas proved to be a good-natured baby, with a healthy appetite and lungs to match when he was displeased. Flynn took to fatherhood with surprising ease, proudly showing off his son to visitors, and often taking the baby for walks around the house in the evening to give Penelope a chance to rest. One such evening in late January, Penelope awoke from a nap to find the house quiet. Concerned, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went in search of her husband and son. She found them in Flynn's study, where he sat in the leather chair by the window, Thomas sleeping peacefully against his chest. Flynn was speaking softly to the baby, his words carrying clearly in the quiet room. "You're a lucky boy, Tommy," he was saying. "Your mother is the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Beautiful, yes, but more than that, she's strong and brave and kind. I hope you grow up to have her heart, her courage." He paused, looking down at the sleeping infant. "I want you to know that while I didn't give you life, I'll spend mine making sure yours is filled with love and security. That's my promise to you, son." Tears welled in Penelope's eyes as she listened. She must have made some small sound, for Flynn looked up, momentarily embarrassed at being caught in such a tender moment. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly, entering the room. "You didn't," he assured her. "Tommy and I were just having a man-to-man talk." Penelope crossed to them, placing a hand on Flynn's shoulder. "I heard. It was beautiful." Flynn covered her hand with his own. "I meant every word." Their eyes met, and Penelope felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. Living as husband and wife, sharing the care of Thomas and the daily rhythms of ranch life, had deepened their connection in ways she hadn't anticipated. Flynn had been true to his word about giving her time, never pressuring her for more than she was ready to give. But lately, she'd found herself wondering what it would be like to truly be his wife in every sense. As though reading her thoughts, Flynn's gaze intensified. "Penelope," he began, but Thomas chose that moment to wake, letting out a hungry cry that broke the spell between them. "Someone has his father's timing," Flynn said with a rueful smile, carefully transferring the baby to Penelope's arms. Later that night, after Thomas was fed and settled in his cradle in what had been the spare room, Penelope stood at the door of the master bedroom, her heart racing. Making a decision, she crossed the hall and knocked softly on Flynn's door. He answered immediately, still fully dressed though the hour was late. "Is Thomas all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "He's fine," she assured him. "Sleeping soundly. I wanted to talk to you." Flynn stepped back, inviting her in. The room was sparsely furnished: a bed, a dresser, a small table with a lamp. Penelope perched on the edge of the bed, suddenly nervous. "What's on your mind?" Flynn asked, sitting beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Penelope gathered her courage. "When we married, you said you wanted to build something real between us, that it would take time." Flynn nodded. I do. I've been thinking about that," she continued. "About what we already have and what we might build together." She met his gaze directly. "I care for you, Flynn. More than I expected to. More each day, if I'm being honest." Flynn's expression softened. "Penelope, please, let me finish. What I'm trying to say is that I'm ready if you are to be your wife completely, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because I want to." The silence that followed seemed endless. Then Flynn reached out, gently taking her hand. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice husky. "Because once we take this step, there's no going back to how things were." Penelope nodded. "I'm certain. I want us to be a real family, you, me, and Thomas." Flynn's other hand came up to cup her cheek. "I've waited for you to be ready," he admitted. "Hoped for it. Because the truth is, Penelope, I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you in my barn." His words sent a shock of joy through her. Emboldened, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Flynn pulled her closer, his arms encircling her with gentle strength. When they finally drew apart, both breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. "Let me show you how much you mean to me." That night, Penelope discovered the difference between passion built on genuine affection and the hollow imitation she'd experienced before. Flynn was patient and tender, mindful of her recent childbirth, placing her comfort and pleasure above his own. In his arms, she felt cherished, desired, and above all, safe. As they lay together afterward, Flynn's heart beat steady beneath her cheek. Penelope marveled at the unexpected turn her life had taken. From desperation to contentment, from abandonment to belonging in the space of a few short months. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she answered honestly. "If I hadn't been thrown out that night, if I hadn't sought shelter in your barn." "Fate has strange ways," Flynn agreed. though I'd like to think I would have found you somehow, somewhere." Penelope smiled at the romantic notion, so at odds with Flynn's usual practicality. "I believe you would have," she said, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. As winter gave way to spring, the Donovan family settled into a rhythm. Thomas grew quickly, a happy baby with Flynn's dark hair and Penelope's blue eyes. Flynn expanded the ranch operations, buying additional grazing land and increasing his herd. Penelope planted a vegetable garden and began keeping a journal of ranch life, discovering a talent for writing she hadn't known she possessed. Their marriage deepened into a true partnership. Flynn consulted Penelope on ranch decisions, valuing her practical mind and fresh perspective. She, in turn, blossomed under his unwavering support, growing more confident in her role as wife, mother, and mistress of the Donovan Ranch. By summer, it was clear to everyone who knew them that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into one of genuine love. The way Flynn's eyes followed Penelope around a room, the gentle touches they exchanged in passing, the easy laughter they shared all spoke of a deep connection that transcended their unusual beginning. In July, Twin Falls held its annual Independence Day celebration. Flynn suggested they attend, bringing Thomas to experience his first community gathering. Penelope hesitated, remembering the judgment she'd faced in town. "Are you sure?" she asked. "People will talk." Flynn smiled, taking her hand. "Let them. You're my wife, Thomas is my son, and I'm proud to have you both by my side." The celebration was held in the town square, with bunting decorating the storefronts and tables laden with food set up under shade trees. As they arrived, Penelope felt the stares and heard the whispers, but Flynn's arm around her waist gave her courage. They were approached by Mrs. Wilkins, the boarding house owner who had thrown Penelope out. The older woman eyed Thomas, now a sturdy 7-month-old with chubby cheeks and an engaging smile. "A fine boy," she commented stiffly. "You both must be very proud." "We are," Flynn replied firmly. "My son and my wife are my greatest blessings." The emphasis on "my" was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Wilkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, well," she said, adjusting her shawl. "I'm glad things worked out for you, Mrs. Donovan." As she walked away, Penelope looked at Flynn with amused disbelief. "Did Mrs. Wilkins just offer something like an apology?" Flynn laughed. "As close as that woman will ever come to one, I'd wager." Throughout the day, Penelope was surprised by the friendly reception they received from many townspeople. The doctor's wife invited her to join a quilting circle. The blacksmith's daughter cooed over Thomas and offered to mind him if Penelope ever needed assistance. The owner of the general store where she'd once worked even approached to say he'd be pleased to have her back if she ever wanted to return. "People can surprise you," Flynn observed as they drove home that evening, a sleeping Thomas cradled in Penelope's arms. "They can be cruel, but they can also come around when shown a different way." "It helps to have a respected rancher as a husband," Penelope pointed out. "Your standing in the community offers protection." "Perhaps," Flynn acknowledged, "but it's also that you've proven yourself. You've built a life here, become part of the community in your own right. People respect that." Penelope considered this as they traveled the familiar road home. It was true that she felt a sense of belonging now to this land, to this community, to the family she and Flynn were building together. As autumn approached again, marking a year since Penelope had first come to Twin Falls, she realized with surprise that she was pregnant once more. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Flynn, choosing a quiet evening after Thomas had been put to bed. They were sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Flynn's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have another child." Flynn went still beside her. "Truly?" he asked, his voice hushed. She nodded, watching his face anxiously. They had never explicitly discussed having more children, and though their marriage had become a love match in truth, she wasn't sure how he would feel about expanding their family. Her worries dissolved as joy transformed his features. He pulled her into a fervent embrace, then drew back to look into her eyes. "Nothing could make me happier," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A child of our love, Penelope, a brother or sister for Thomas." "You're pleased, then?" she asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Please doesn't begin to cover it," he assured her, dropping to one knee before her and resting his hands gently on her waist. "I love you, Penelope Donovan, more than I ever thought possible, and I love the family we're creating together." He pressed a gentle kiss to her stomach, then rose to claim her lips in a kiss that conveyed all the depth of his feelings. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Penelope found herself more tired than she had been with Thomas. Flynn was attentive to the point of hovering, often drawing teasing complaints from Penelope about being treated like fragile china. "Can you blame me for wanting to take care of you?" he would respond. "You and our children are my whole world." As winter settled over the land once more, they prepared for the new arrival expected in early spring. Flynn converted a small adjoining room off the master bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands from pine harvested on the ranch. Penelope knitted tiny garments and quilted a blanket, while Thomas, now toddling and beginning to speak, watched their preparations with curious interest. "Baby," he would say, patting Penelope's growing belly. "Baby come." "That's right, sweetheart," she would answer, marveling at how complete her happiness had become. On a clear March morning in 1887, with snow still blanketing the ground but hints of spring in the air, Penelope went into labor. This time, the birth progressed more quickly. Mrs. Blackthorne arrived promptly, and by early afternoon, Penelope delivered a healthy baby girl with a dusting of auburn hair and her father's brown eyes. "She's perfect," Flynn whispered, cradling his daughter with the same wonder he had shown with Thomas, but now tinged with the confidence of experience. "What shall we name her?" Penelope had been considering names throughout her pregnancy. "I was thinking of Alina after your mother," she suggested. "If that would please you." Flynn's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "It would mean more to me than I can say," he admitted. "Alina Penelope Donovan," she decided. "Ellie for short." Flynn brought Thomas in to meet his sister, carefully supervising as the toddler peered at the swaddled infant. Thomas reached out one hesitant finger to touch the baby's cheek, then looked up at his parents with wide eyes. "My baby?" he asked. "Yes," Flynn assured him. "Your sister. And you'll be the best big brother a little girl could ask for." As Penelope watched her husband and son bonding over the newest member of their family, she felt a sense of completion, of rightness. The journey that had begun in desperation, 8 months pregnant and thrown out, forced to seek shelter in a stranger's barn, had led her to a life richer and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. That evening, after the children were settled, Flynn joined Penelope in their bedroom. She was sitting up against the pillows, tired but content. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "You ever think about how we started?" he asked. "How close we came to never meeting?" Penelope nodded. "Sometimes. If I'd chosen another road out of town that night, if you hadn't checked the barn that morning." "Life turns on such small moments," Flynn mused. "I thank God every day that you found your way to my barn." "As do I," she said softly, "though at the time it felt like the lowest point of my life." Flynn brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? From your darkest hour came our greatest happiness. He was right, Penelope realized. The moment that had seemed like an ending had been, in truth, just the beginning. 5 years later, 1892, the Donovan Ranch spread across the rolling hills outside Twin Falls, Idaho. Its boundaries expanded. Its buildings improved and added to over the years. The house, once merely comfortable, had become truly beautiful under Penelope's care, a home filled with books and music, laughter and love. On a warm June evening, the family gathered on the wide front porch after supper. 7-year-old Thomas sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood under his father's watchful instruction. 5-year-old Alina, her auburn hair in braids, leaned against her mother's side on the porch swing, listening as Penelope read aloud from Little Women. 3-year-old William, named for Flynn's father, played with wooden blocks nearby, occasionally demanding his older siblings' attention with his latest creation. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant hues, Flynn caught Penelope's eye over the children's heads. The look that passed between them spoke volumes, a shared acknowledgment of the life they had built, the family they had created, the love that had grown from such unlikely beginnings. Later, after the children were tucked in bed with stories and kisses, Flynn and Penelope stood together at the pasture fence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I have news," Flynn said, slipping an arm around her waist. "The railroad's coming through. They want to buy some of our eastern acreage for the line." Penelope leaned into him, considering the implications. "What do you think?" "I think it's progress we can't stop," he answered honestly, "and it could be good for us. Easier shipping for our cattle, better access to markets." Penelope nodded. "The children will be able to travel to school in town more easily when they are older." They had discussed this often, the importance of education, their shared hope that their children would have opportunities neither of them had enjoyed in their youth. "I was also thinking," Flynn continued, "about that idea you had last year, about opening part of the ranch to guests from back east, city folk who want to experience the Wild West." He smiled at the notion. "With the railroad, that becomes more feasible." Penelope turned to face him, surprised and pleased. "You've been considering it seriously, then?" "I have. Your articles in the Twin Falls Gazette have attracted attention. People write to ask if they can visit the ranch you describe so vividly. Why not invite them for a fee, of course?" Penelope's occasional pieces for the local newspaper had indeed gained popularity. Her warm, observant writing style capturing the beauty and challenges of ranch life in a way that resonated with readers. "It would mean changes," she cautioned. "Building accommodations, hiring more help." Flynn nodded. "True, but change isn't always bad. Look at us." He gestured toward the house where their children slept peacefully. "The biggest change in my life brought me everything I hold dear." Penelope smiled, remembering the frightened, desperate young woman she had been and the strong, confident wife and mother she had become. "Mine too," she agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the future. "You know what today is?" Flynn asked suddenly. Penelope thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Tuesday," Flynn laughed softly. "It's 7 years to the day since I found a beautiful, very pregnant woman sleeping in my barn." Penelope's eyes widened. "Is it really? I hadn't realized." "I remember it clearly," Flynn said, drawing her closer. "I walked in expecting to find a stray animal or perhaps a saddle tramp seeking shelter. Instead, I found the woman who would change my life forever." "I was hardly at my best that day," Penelope reminded him wryly. "Dirty, exhausted, terrified. And still the most captivating woman I'd ever seen, Flynn insisted. There was something in your eyes, Penelope, a strength, a determination, even in your darkest hour. I knew then that you were someone extraordinary. You saw more than was there, she demurred. No, Flynn disagreed gently. I saw exactly what was there, what you couldn't see yourself at the time. The woman you would become, perhaps. The woman you were always meant to be. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I had this made in boys, he said, opening it to reveal a gold band set with small diamonds in a delicate pattern. To replace the simple ring we used when we married. A proper wedding band for the love of my life. Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes as Flynn slipped the ring onto her finger above her original wedding band. It's beautiful, she whispered. But you didn't need to. I wanted to, he interrupted. To mark this anniversary and all that we've built together. He cupped her face in his hands. I love you more today than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow. As their lips met under the vast Idaho sky, stars emerging above them like scattered diamonds, Penelope Donovan reflected on the journey that had brought her here from Philadelphia debutante to unwed mother, from desperate refugee to beloved wife and respected rancher's wife. A journey that had begun on the worst night of her life and led to more happiness than she had ever dared to dream possible. In the darkest moments, she knew now, lay the seeds of our greatest joys. We need only the courage to endure, the hope to continue, and occasionally, the blessing of finding refuge even if it's just in a stranger's barn on a rainy night. As they walked hand in hand back to their home, to the life they had created together, Penelope's heart was full with the knowledge that sometimes the end of one dream makes room for another, far greater than we could have imagined. And sometimes, when we think we have lost everything, we are really just finding our way to where we truly belong.